It was supposed to be a quiet night. I'd babysat for Tim and Max plenty of times before, and they were the kind of kids who never gave any trouble. Tonight, they were parked on the living room couch, iPads glowing in their hands, both fully engrossed in whatever game they were playing. The clock on the wall chimed softly. It was just past 8, and the neighborhood outside was silent as usual. The glow of the streetlights barely broke through the thick curtains, and for a moment, I almost felt like we were the only ones left in the world. There was something different in the air, though, a chill that crept up the walls and settled over the room. It wasn't the usual hum of the house, the little noises I'd grown accustomed to during my other babysitting gigs. Tonight felt heavier somehow, like the air was saturated with something thick and unsettling. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was this prickling sensation at the back of my neck that I just couldn't shake. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably nothing, a result of spending too much time reading horror stories and true crime online. But even so, the feeling lingered. I watched the boys for a moment, half expecting them to notice the eerie atmosphere too, but they remained oblivious, lost in their screens. Taking a deep breath, I tried to focus on my own phone, scrolling through messages from my friends who were busy planning a night out. Just then, a loud knock echoed from the front door, slicing through the silence. I nearly jumped, my heart skipping a beat. I shot a glance at the boys, who looked up, momentarily startled. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They both nodded, but Max shrugged, looking unbothered. "Probably just a delivery or something," he mumbled, already turning his attention back to his game. But I knew there wasn't any delivery scheduled. The moms hadn't mentioned expecting anyone, and besides, they'd usually call if something like that was arranged. Slowly, I got up from the couch, feeling an uncomfortable twist in my stomach. The hallway to the door seemed longer than usual, stretching out in front of me as if it were trying to keep me from reaching the door. I hesitated, then forced myself to peek through the peephole. All I could see was a figure, tall, hunched over, wearing a gray hoodie that cast shadows over their face. I strained my eyes, hoping for some recognizable feature, but the person was deliberately leaning forward, hiding their face. A shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't unusual to get knocks on the door, but something about this person's posture felt wrong, like they were trying too hard to conceal themselves. I swallowed, feeling my throat tighten. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. No answer, just silence. My heart raced, thudding loudly in my chest as I waited, but whoever was on the other side of the door didn't say a word. After a few seconds, I backed away, deciding it was better not to engage. Whoever it was could go away on their own. As I returned to the living room, the boys were looking at me with mild curiosity. "Who was it?" Tim asked, his eyes wide. "Probably nothing," I lied, trying to sound casual. "Just someone at the wrong address, I think." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. I turned off the lights in the living room, hoping the darkness would make it less obvious that we were home. The boys grumbled a little, but I assured them they could keep playing on their tablets. I just wanted to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see in. Minutes passed. I stayed alert, ears straining for any sound that might signal the stranger had left. I peeked through the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. To my relief, the porch was empty, and the street was as quiet as ever. Maybe I'd overreacted, letting my imagination get the best of me. I returned to the couch, trying to relax, but that prickling feeling at the back of my neck wouldn't go away. I glanced at my phone, debating whether to text the boys' mothers and let them know what had happened. They were out for a much-needed night off, and the last thing I wanted was to worry them unnecessarily. But as I stared at the screen, another knock sounded at the door. This one harder, more insistent. My stomach twisted. This time I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, hoping that if I ignored it, whoever was out there would go away. The boys looked up again, sensing the tension in the room. Max's gaze shifted to the darkened window, his brows knitting in confusion. "Jess, are you sure it's nothing?" he whispered, a hint of fear in his voice. "Yeah, of course," I replied, my voice a little too forced. "Just let's stay quiet for now, okay?" But as the moments passed, the knocking didn't stop. Whoever it was kept knocking, harder each time, as if they were growing impatient. I felt trapped, my mind racing with possibilities. It could be anything: a lost neighbor, a prank, or something far worse. My thoughts spiraled, but I tried to keep calm for the boys' sake, forcing a reassuring smile as best I could. Eventually, the knocking stopped. We all sat in silence, the tension thick enough to cut. After what felt like an eternity, I dared to glance out the window again. The figure was gone. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, I noticed something. There across the street stood the same figure. The stranger hadn't left at all. He'd simply moved, lurking just far enough to stay out of sight, but close enough to keep watching. An icy chill washed over me. The silence that followed was crushing. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at my phone, trying to steady my breathing. The boys were still looking at me, eyes wide with unspoken questions. I forced a smile and told them everything was fine, but inside I felt anything but calm. My pulse throbbed in my temples, and every nerve in my body was on high alert. Whoever that man was, he hadn't gone far. He was still out there watching. Minutes passed in tense quiet. I kept glancing at the window, hoping to catch sight of him again, to confirm to myself that he was really gone. But the street remained empty, bathed in the eerie glow of the streetlights. Trying to ignore the prickling feeling at the back of my neck, I picked up my phone and checked the time. Nearly half an hour had passed since that first knock, yet the unease still sat heavy in my stomach. I debated texting the boys' moms, but decided against it. There was no reason to ruin their night out over something that was probably just my imagination. I was on edge, though, every little sound making me jump. A creak in the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator. Each one seemed louder, more sinister. I forced myself to focus on the boys, hoping that keeping an eye on them would distract me from the crawling sense of dread. Another half hour passed, and the boys had settled back into their games, seemingly reassured by my forced calmness. I was just beginning to relax when I noticed something strange on my phone. A missed call from an unknown number. I hadn't heard it ring, but there it was, the notification glaring up at me. I frowned, tapping on it to check the time. It had come through just a few minutes ago, right around the time I'd felt that intense chill, like someone was watching me. My finger hovered over the callback button, but I hesitated. It could have been a telemarketer or someone calling the wrong number. But what if it wasn't? What if it was connected to the man outside? I felt a shiver run down my spine at the thought. Deciding it was best to ignore it, I shoved the phone into my pocket and tried to push the worry from my mind. But before I could fully dismiss it, my phone buzzed again. A text message this time. It was from the same unknown number, and all it said was, I can see you. My breath hitched, and I felt my hands start to shake. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. I didn't recognize the number, and no one else knew I was here tonight except the boys' moms. How could this stranger know I was here, know enough to send me that message? I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to stay calm for the boys' sake. They were still absorbed in their games, blissfully unaware of the fear clawing at my insides. I felt a sudden urge to check the windows and doors, to make sure everything was locked, but I didn't want to alarm them. Instead, I slowly got up and made my way to the front door, moving as quietly as I could. The door was still locked, but I double-checked it anyway, my fingers trembling as I tested the lock. I checked the windows next, carefully pulling back the curtains just enough to peek outside. The street was still empty, but the silence felt oppressive, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. The lights cast long shadows across the lawn, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the street. My heart leapt, but when I looked again, it was gone. I backed away from the window, forcing myself to stay calm. I didn't want to give in to panic, but every instinct in me was screaming that something was wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. Whoever was out there was watching, waiting. I couldn't just sit here and do nothing, but calling the police felt like overreacting. After all, what would I tell them? That a man knocked on the door, then stood across the street watching? It wasn't exactly a crime, but still, something about this felt very, very wrong. Just then, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. This time it read, "Why did you turn off the lights?" My heart dropped, and a wave of cold dread washed over me. He had been watching, paying attention to every little move I made. I tried to steady my hands as I typed back, "Who is this?" and hit send. No response. Minutes passed, and I stayed rooted to the spot, my eyes glued to the phone, waiting for another message. But nothing came. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to wake the boys' moms, to call someone, anyone, for help, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I kept telling myself it was probably a prank, a coincidence, something that would make sense in the morning. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Another knock. This time it was softer, more insistent. I froze, my eyes darting toward the door. Whoever it was, they hadn't left. They were still out there, playing some twisted game, waiting for me to make the next move. I took a shaky breath, trying to gather the courage to confront them, but every instinct in me screamed to stay away from the door. Instead, I backed up, pressing my back against the wall, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The boys glanced up, sensing my fear, and I forced a smile, telling them everything was fine. They didn't look convinced, but they didn't press me, going back to their games with a bit more caution. I stayed by the wall, waiting, listening for any sound that might give away the stranger's next move. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. I pictured him breaking down the door, sneaking in through a window, lurking somewhere in the dark, just waiting to pounce. I tried to shake the thoughts from my mind, but they clung to me, feeding my growing panic. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, afraid that any noise would draw him back. But as the seconds ticked by, the silence deepened, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was gone. I stepped away from the wall, inching toward the window to check. But as I reached the edge, I froze. There, across the street, just visible in the shadows, stood the same figure, watching, waiting, his face still hidden beneath the hood. He hadn't gone anywhere. He was just waiting for me to slip up, to make one wrong move. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart pounded as I backed away from the window, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. I could feel the weight of his gaze through the glass, as if he were looking straight through me. This wasn't just a prank, and it wasn't a mistake. He was here, watching us. For what purpose, I couldn't even guess, but I knew I couldn't let him get any closer to the boys or me. I clenched my phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the call button. Should I call the police? I didn't have any concrete evidence, just an ominous feeling and a few creepy text messages. But I also knew that if I didn't do something, I'd be putting us all in danger. The kids were starting to sense my anxiety, glancing at me with fearful expressions, their games forgotten. Then, just as I was about to dial, my phone buzzed again. It was another text from the unknown number. "It's cold out here. Why don't you let me in?" My stomach twisted with dread. He was taunting me, waiting for me to react. I wanted to scream, to tell him to go away, but I knew better than to give him any satisfaction. Instead, I forced myself to take a deep breath and told the boys to stay put, promising them everything was okay. The truth was, I didn't know if it was okay. I felt a creeping sense of dread, an awful certainty that if I didn't do something now, things would only get worse. At that moment, headlights appeared at the end of the street. My heart leapt with hope as I saw a familiar car pulling into the driveway. It was the boys' mothers back from their night out. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a cold spike of fear. What if he tried something now, with them out there? What if he decided to make his move as they were getting out of the car? Without thinking, I threw open the door and rushed outside, waving my arms to get their attention. "Don't get out of the car!" I shouted, my voice high and frantic. They froze, eyes wide with alarm as I ran up to the driver's side. "There's a man. He's been watching the house all night. He's across the street right now." The two women exchanged terrified glances, and one of them, Lisa, turned to peer through the windshield in the direction I'd pointed. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I turned back to the street, pointing toward the spot where I'd last seen him, but he was gone. The empty stretch of road stared back at us, silent and unthreatening, as if mocking me. A wave of confusion and fear washed over me. Had he left? Or was he hiding somewhere else now, waiting to catch us off guard? Lisa's friend, Karen, rolled down her window, her face a mixture of fear and disbelief. Are you sure, Jess? She asked, glancing nervously at the street. Maybe it was just, I don't know, a neighbor? No, it wasn't, I insisted, my voice shaking. He knocked on the door earlier and then started texting me. He said he could see us. I showed them the texts and their faces went pale. They exchanged another look, a silent conversation passing between them before Lisa pulled out her phone and dialed the police. She gave them our location, her voice calm but trembling, while Karen took a deep breath and looked back at me. Let's get inside, she said, her tone resolute. Once inside, I made sure the door was securely locked, feeling a bit safer now that the adults were here. The boys clung to their mothers, eyes wide with fear as they listened to our whispered conversation. I tried to reassure them with a smile, but I could see they weren't convinced. To be honest, I wasn't either. The minutes ticked by slowly, the silence thick and oppressive as we waited for the police to arrive. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the man reappear. But the street remained empty. My mind spun with questions. Why was he here? What did he want? And how did he know to target this house? Finally, the flash of red and blue lights lit up the front yard. Two officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached the house. Lisa and Karen explained what had happened, and I showed them the texts. The officers exchanged a glance, nodding slowly, before one of them stepped outside to inspect the area while the other stayed with us. The officer who remained began asking me questions, trying to piece together a timeline of events. I told him about the knocks, the strange messages, and the figure I'd seen across the street. He listened intently, his face grave, taking notes on a small pad. He seemed calm, reassuring, but I could tell he wasn't taking this lightly. A few minutes later, the other officer returned, shaking his head. No sign of him. No footprints either. But we'll keep an eye on the neighborhood tonight. If he shows up again, call us immediately. Lisa thanked them, and we all watched as the officers returned to their car and drove off, the red and blue lights disappearing down the street. Despite their assurance, I didn't feel any safer. The man might have been gone for now, but I had a feeling he wasn't done with us. I sat down on the couch, exhausted, my mind racing with everything that had happened. The boys' moms thanked me, but their words seemed distant, muffled by the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the man was still out there waiting for his next chance. I replayed the night in my mind, every knock, every message, every moment of silent terror, trying to find some meaning, some clue to explain why he'd chosen us. Later, as I drove home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a dark figure lurking in the shadows. The streetlights cast long shadows across the road, stretching and shifting with every turn. I knew it was just my imagination, a leftover echo of fear from the night's events, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally got home, I locked the door and checked every window, making sure they were all secure. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, sinking down onto the couch, my body heavy with exhaustion. I stared at my phone, half expecting another text, another chilling reminder that he knew where I was, but my screen stayed blank, the silence oppressive in my small apartment. As the days passed, the memory of that night lingered, an uncomfortable shadow that refused to fade. I tried to tell myself it was over, that he'd moved on, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. Every time I passed a shadowy figure on the street, every time I heard a knock at the door, I felt that same cold dread, that awful certainty that he wasn't finished with me yet. And as I lay in bed each night, staring at the ceiling, I wondered if I'd ever feel safe again. I had always loved the independence of living alone. My little apartment on the third floor of a converted row house in Philadelphia was cozy and quiet, just how I liked it. The building was old, with creaky floors and narrow hallways, and my unit was the topmost, tucked away from the noise of the street. The walls were thin, though, and I could usually hear my downstairs neighbors faintly when they argued or when they shuffled around their living room. But I was used to it, and those small disturbances were easy to ignore. My days followed a comforting rhythm. Wake up, go to work, come home, and unwind with my two cats, Ollie and Luna. They were my constant companions, always ready to curl up on my lap as I watched TV or read in the evenings. In a way, I felt like I was never truly alone with them around. I'd grown comfortable with the quirks of the old building, even found a strange peace in the way its age crept into the floors and walls. Then, small things began to change. It was subtle at first. I'd leave for work in the morning only to find my door handle slightly loose when I returned, as if someone had been fiddling with it. I told myself it was just wear and tear from the years, maybe even the cats playing too close to the door. Still, a faint feeling of unease started to linger at the edges of my mind. One night, as I was settling into bed, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They were soft, almost too soft to be sure I wasn't imagining them. I froze listening intently, but after a few moments, the sound faded, leaving only the usual hum of silence. I told myself it was probably a neighbor, though something about it had felt wrong. Things took a more annoying turn when my air conditioner started leaking. One morning, I stepped into a small puddle by the window, the source of the leak being the AC unit half secured into the window. I reported it to the property management group, and by that afternoon, they'd already scheduled a repair visit. I was impressed with how quickly they handled it, relieved that I wouldn't have to worry about water damage or mold setting in. They told me that a technician would be over the next day to fix it, and I was grateful for the quick response. The following day, the technician arrived just as I was getting home from work. He was an unremarkable man, dressed in a plain uniform with no company logo. I noticed he didn't wear a badge or name tag, but I assumed he was just a regular contractor. He greeted me politely, a bit of a forced smile on his face, and asked if he could come in to check the unit. "Sure, go ahead," I said, gesturing toward the living room where the AC unit was installed. He nodded, moving past me into the room, barely glancing at anything as he went straight to the window. I tried not to hover to hide, instead focusing on calming my cats, who were eyeing the stranger with suspicion. He worked quickly, occasionally muttering under his breath as he tightened screws and adjusted the frame. The repair only took about 15 minutes. When he was finished, he straightened up and dusted his hands, giving me a quick nod. "Should be all set now. Just make sure to keep an eye on it for a few days," he said. "Thanks, I appreciate it," I replied, already relieved that the puddles would stop forming on the floor. As he headed toward the door, he paused, turning to me with an odd look. "By the way, do you have an extra key for the main door downstairs?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes lingering a bit too long on my face. I felt a small jolt of confusion. "A key for the main door?" I echoed, wondering if I'd misheard him. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "The property management mentioned there might be some issue with access to the main building entrance. They asked me to check with you if you had an extra key they could borrow." Something about his tone didn't sit right with me. Property management had never mentioned anything about needing a spare key, and I couldn't understand why they'd send a technician just to ask for one. I shook my head slowly, forcing a polite smile. "I don't, actually, and if there's an issue, they should have their own keys, right?" He seemed to hesitate, his eyes flicking down to the floor before he shrugged. "Yeah, I suppose you're right," he mumbled, the forced smile returning to his face. "Just thought I'd check." There was an awkward pause as he stood there, not moving to leave. I felt a prickle of discomfort, suddenly aware of how small my apartment felt with him standing so close to the door. "Well, thanks again for fixing the AC," I said, trying to subtly signal that it was time for him to go. He nodded, finally turning to leave, but something in his expression as he walked out made me uneasy. He glanced back at me over his shoulder as he stepped into the hallway, giving me a look that I couldn't quite decipher. There was something about it that felt off, like he was holding back a thought he wanted to say but didn't. I locked the door behind him the moment he was gone, feeling an unexpected wave of relief. I tried to shake off the discomfort, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably just a weird interaction, nothing more. But as I turned back toward the living room, my gaze fell on the window and the AC unit, my mind replaying the encounter. The look he'd given me, the insistence about the key, it all felt too strange to ignore. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't fully relax. Even as I tried to immerse myself in a book, my mind kept drifting back to the technician. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. I was used to my solitude, used to the comfort of my own space, but tonight that peace felt disturbed. As I lay in bed later, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the old building, I found myself wondering if I'd made a mistake. The days that followed were anything but peaceful. I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over me since the technician's visit. Every time I passed the main door of the building, I half expected to see him standing there, watching me with that unreadable expression he'd given me as he left. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but each night as I locked my apartment door, that same gnawing unease returned, stronger than before. Things only got stranger. 2 days after the repair, I noticed the main entrance door was slightly ajar when I got home from work. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to leave it unlocked by accident, but this felt different. The door wasn't just unlocked, it was wide open, as if someone had forgotten to close it entirely. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the empty hallway, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the corridor was empty. Still, I hurried up the stairs to my apartment, locking the door behind me and checking it twice. That night, as I settled into bed, I felt more on edge than usual. The silence of the building felt oppressive, and every little creak or distant thud seemed magnified in the stillness. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it, faint, almost inaudible footsteps outside my door. My heart jumped, and I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps paused directly in front of my apartment, and I held my breath, waiting. There was a soft sound, like someone brushing against the door, and then silence. I lay there, my heart racing, half expecting the handle to turn, but after a moment, the footsteps resumed, fading down the hallway. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Living alone could make anyone paranoid, I reasoned, especially in an old building with so many unfamiliar sounds. But when I stepped out of my apartment to head to work, I stopped dead in my tracks. There were faint scratch marks around my door handle, tiny but unmistakable, as if someone had been trying to jimmy it open. A chill ran down my spine as I examined the marks. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone had definitely tried to get into my apartment. My mind flashed back to the technician's odd request for the key. Could it be him? I pushed the thought away, telling myself it was impossible. But even as I tried to brush it off, a sense of dread settled in my stomach. When I got home that evening, I felt a sense of relief seeing that my apartment door was still locked, but the building felt different now, as if a shadow had settled over it. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and double-checking the bolt, something I'd never felt the need to do before. I even pulled a chair over and propped it against the door just in case. I knew it was silly, like something out of a horror movie, but the small precaution made me feel a little safer. The following day, I decided to install a security camera just outside my door. It was a simple model I'd ordered online, easy to set up, and small enough to go unnoticed by anyone passing by. If someone tried to tamper with my door again, I'd at least have proof. As I adjusted the angle of the camera, a part of me felt foolish, but another part felt a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in days, I felt like I had a little control over the situation. That night, I sat up late, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the creeping anxiety. I kept glancing at the app linked to the security camera, checking the live feed to reassure myself that nothing was out of place. The hallway was quiet and still, empty, except for the faint glow of the emergency exit sign at the end. Around midnight, just as I was about to turn off the lights, my phone vibrated with a notification from the camera app. My pulse quickened as I opened it, my breath catching in my throat when I saw the live feed. There, standing just outside my door, was the technician. He was wearing the same plain uniform, his face partially obscured by the shadow cast from the hallway light. He stood perfectly still, his hand hovering near the door handle, as if deciding whether to try it. I watched in horror as he slowly reached out, his fingers brushing against the handle before pulling back. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the door, then he turned and walked back down the hall, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, frozen, staring at my phone screen long after he was gone. My mind raced, thoughts tangling together in a panicked blur. Why was he back? How did he get inside the building? And what did he want with my apartment? I tried to tell myself it was a misunderstanding, that maybe he was checking something unrelated to me. But the look on his face, the way he lingered by my door, it felt wrong. I barely slept that night, my mind replaying the footage over and over. I kept my phone by my side, checking the live feed every few minutes, half expecting to see him return. Each time, the hallway was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, somewhere nearby, watching. The next morning, I called the property management office as soon as they opened. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation, describing the technician and his strange behavior. There was a pause on the other end, and I heard the manager sigh. "We didn't send anyone back to your apartment after the repair," he said slowly. "The technician we hired was a temporary contractor, and his job should have ended with the AC repair." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So he wasn't supposed to be here last night?" "No," the manager replied, his tone laced with concern. "In fact, we don't even have him on staff anymore. I'll look into this, but I suggest you take extra precautions until we can figure out what's going on." I hung up, my mind reeling. Whoever that man was, he had no reason to be in my building anymore, let alone at my door in the middle of the night. The realization that he'd been there, so close, with no legitimate reason, sent a chill through me. That evening, I decided to tell a friend about what had been happening. She listened, her face growing more alarmed with every detail. "Emma, you need to be careful," she said, her voice tense. "This doesn't sound like a coincidence. Maybe he's been watching you." The thought made my skin crawl, but I nodded, knowing she was right. The idea that someone might be targeting me, watching my every move, was almost too much to process. But as much as I wanted to pretend it was nothing, the evidence was there, impossible to ignore. That night, I felt more alone than ever in my little apartment. The familiar creaks and groans of the building that once brought me comfort now felt ominous, if the very walls were closing in around me. I lay in bed, listening to every sound, my heart pounding with each imagined footstep in the hall. And then, just as I was beginning to drift into an uneasy sleep, I heard it again, the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps outside my door. The footsteps outside my door were slow and measured, each step more deliberate than the last, sending a wave of icy fear through me. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, paralyzed, straining to hear every detail. I didn't dare move, afraid that even the slightest sound might give away that I was awake and listening. It was as if I could feel his presence through the door, his attention focused solely on me. The footsteps stopped directly outside my apartment. I held my breath, every nerve in my body screaming at me to do something, anything, but fear had rooted me to the spot. I waited, counting the seconds, but he didn't move. Instead, I heard the faintest scraping sound, like something thin and metallic brushing against the door handle. My mind raced with the possibilities. Was he trying to pick the lock? Did he have a key? In a moment of sheer desperation, I grabbed my phone and opened the security camera app, my hands shaking so much that it was difficult to navigate. When the feed loaded, I felt my stomach drop. He was there, just as I'd feared. The same technician, standing motionless in front of my door, his face partially obscured in the dim light of the hallway. I could see his hand on the door handle, his expression calm, almost as if he were contemplating his next move. A surge of anger mixed with my fear. This was my home, my safe space, and he was violating it. I couldn't just lie there, waiting for him to do whatever he'd planned. I forced myself to sit up, still gripping my phone, and with a burst of courage, I dialed 911. I whispered my address and explained the situation to the dispatcher, who assured me that officers were on their way. The dispatcher's calm voice was like an anchor, grounding me as I tried to control my fear. As I waited, I kept my eyes on the live feed. He hadn't left. He was still standing there, his hand moving slowly across the doorframe. At one point, he leaned forward, his face drawing closer to the peephole, as if he were trying to listen to what was happening inside. I felt a surge of nausea at the thought that he could hear me, that he knew I was so close, yet unable to stop him. Minutes felt like Hours. I clutched my phone, the dispatcher still on the line, quietly reassuring me that help was on the way. Just then, I saw the technician glance down the hallway, his expression shifting as he heard something, a noise from the stairwell, perhaps, or the sound of approaching footsteps. He straightened, his face hardening, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor just as the first flashes of red and blue lights illuminated my window. Moments later, I heard a knock, a real knock, firm and steady, and I scrambled out of bed to open the door. Two police officers stood there, their expressions serious as they scanned the hallway, weapons ready. I let them in, my relief mingling with a new wave of fear as I tried to explain everything, from the initial repair visit to the unsettling behavior I'd captured on my camera. They took my statement, asking me to show them the footage. As I replayed the video, I felt a strange mix of validation and dread. The officer watching the screen nodded grimly, his face tightening as he took in the technician's deliberate, unsettling actions. "We'll investigate," one of them assured me, his tone serious. "It's clear this man wasn't here for any legitimate reason, and it's possible he's been targeting other tenants too. We'll have someone from the precinct patrol the area tonight, and we'll keep you updated." I thanked them, feeling a little lighter knowing that they were taking this seriously. But as the officers left, I realized that the reassurance didn't erase the lingering fear that had settled deep within me. The technician might have been scared off tonight, but he knew where I lived. He knew I was alone, and he'd shown me, without a doubt, that he wasn't afraid to push boundaries to get what he wanted. In the days that followed, I took every precaution I could think of. I changed my locks, invested in a sturdier security system, and even bought an extra bolt for the door. The property management confirmed that the technician was, in fact, an external contractor who had no valid reason to return after the initial visit. They assured me they'd never employ him again, but that did little to calm my nerves. Every evening when I returned home, I found myself hesitating before entering, scanning the hallway, expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. I'd walk briskly, my keys ready, my heart pounding until I'd lock myself safely inside. But even then, I couldn't fully relax. The once comforting silence of my apartment had turned into a source of anxiety, each creak or shift in the building sending a jolt of fear through me. The nights were the worst. I kept the security camera app open on my phone, checking it obsessively, watching for any sign of movement outside my door. I slept with the lights on, my mind filled with the memory of his shadowy figure standing in the hallway, his hand brushing against the door as if testing the limits of my defenses. A week later, I received a call from the police. They'd investigated the man, but hadn't been able to locate him. It seemed he had disappeared. No address, no record beyond his temporary contract with the management company. They promised to continue searching, but the officer's tone told me that I shouldn't hold my breath. The uncertainty gnawed at me, the knowledge that he was still out there, possibly watching, waiting. I started to question every stranger I passed on the street, every figure lingering a little too long outside my building. I grew more withdrawn, rarely leaving my apartment unless absolutely necessary. My friends grew concerned, urging me to move, to leave the building behind, but I hesitated. The thought of abandoning my home felt like letting him win, like giving him the power to control my life. But even as I told myself I was stronger than my fear, that he couldn't intimidate me into leaving, a part of me knew I was lying. My sense of safety had been shattered, replaced by a constant undercurrent of dread. Each night, as I bolted the door and checked the camera one last time, I found myself wondering if he'd return, if he'd try again, bolder and more determined than before. Eventually, I made a decision. I packed my belongings, broke my lease, and left Philadelphia, determined to leave the memory of that night and him behind. The fear didn't disappear, but it dulled, fading into the background as I rebuilt my life in a new city. I avoided old habits, avoided routines that might make it easy for someone to find me again. But even now, months later, when I hear a creak in the hallway or a soft knock at the door, my heart skips a beat, and I feel the shadows closing in, reminding me that some fears don't vanish. They linger, haunting you long after you've left them behind. The sun was sinking low as Liam and I set up camp on the isolated beach, the golden light stretching over the sand like a warm blanket. We'd spent hours driving down the winding coastal roads to get here, and finally, the reward was in front of us. Miles of empty shoreline, with nothing but the rhythmic sound of waves and the occasional squawk of a distant seagull. It felt like we'd stumbled into another world, untouched and peaceful. The air was cool and salty, and I took a deep breath, letting the calmness of the place wash over me. Liam worked on pitching our tent while I gathered driftwood for a fire. We laughed and chatted, both of us giddy at the idea of spending the weekend entirely off the grid. It wasn't often that we had the chance to escape from work and responsibilities, to just be together without any distractions. The sand was warm under my feet, and the ocean glistened in the fading light, giving the whole place an almost magical feel. I couldn't imagine a better setting for us to reconnect. As the last light of day faded, we huddled around the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about everything and nothing. The stars started to appear, tiny pinpricks in the vast black sky, and I felt a sense of awe at the beauty of it all. It was rare to find such quiet in the world, especially living in a city where noise was constant, but here it was just us, the crackling fire and the gentle crash of waves. Yet as the darkness grew, I started to feel an odd sense of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just a subtle prickling at the back of my neck, as if something or someone was watching us. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the unfamiliarity of the place. It was silly, I told myself. We were probably the only people for miles. But then, as I looked out towards the dunes, I caught sight of a figure standing at the top of a ridge, silhouetted against the night sky. The firelight was too dim to see any details, but I could tell it was a person. Tall, motionless, just standing there, watching us. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't unusual to see other campers or fishermen along the coast, but there was something off about this figure. He, or whoever it was, seemed to be facing us, but just barely visible in the distance. "Liam," I said, nudging him. "Do you see that?" He turned, following my gaze, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the dunes. He shrugged, flashing me a reassuring smile. "Probably just a hiker," he said casually. "There's a trailhead about half a mile back. Maybe they were just passing through." "Maybe," I replied, though the unease lingered. I tried to brush it off, but the image of that figure stuck in my mind, an odd thorn in the otherwise perfect evening. Liam went back to his marshmallow, laughing about something, but my attention kept drifting back to the spot where I'd seen the stranger. As the night wore on, we eventually crawled into our tent, the ocean breeze cool and soothing as it drifted through the fabric. Liam fell asleep quickly, his soft breathing mingling with the sound of the waves, but I lay awake, staring at the shadowy ceiling of the tent, listening. Every little sound seemed amplified. The rustle of the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, the hiss of the waves. I tried to convince myself that it was just nerves, but my mind kept returning to that figure on the dune. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke to the soft, gray light of dawn seeping into the tent. Liam was already outside, boiling water for coffee. I rubbed my eyes, stretching, the events of the previous night feeling hazy, almost dreamlike. As I stepped out into the cool morning air, the beach looked as peaceful as ever, the sand smooth and untouched except for our footprints. Liam handed me a mug of coffee, and we sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb over the horizon. The unease from the night before felt distant, like a shadow that had faded with the light. I took a deep breath, letting the salty air fill my lungs, and told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind brought on by the isolation. But later, as we walked along the shore collecting shells and exploring tide pools, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly alone. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching us. But the beach remained empty, vast and silent. Still, the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. That evening, as we settled down by the fire again, I found myself scanning the dunes, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. Liam noticed my distraction and laughed, teasing me gently. "You still looking for your mystery hiker?" I forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Guess I'm just jumpy. It's weird being out here with no one else around." "It's what we wanted, though, right?" He wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close. No city noise, no crowds, just us and the stars. I leaned into him, telling myself to let go of my worries. He was right. We'd come here to escape, to find a piece of the world that was still untouched, and I didn't want to let a silly feeling ruin that. But as the night deepened, my eyes kept drifting to the dunes, my mind restless. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, I saw him again. This time he was closer, standing halfway down the dune, his figure dark and motionless against the pale sand. My breath caught, and I grabbed Liam's arm, pointing. There! Do you see him? Liam turned quickly, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the figure. For a moment, we both just stared, the fire crackling between us, casting eerie shadows across the sand. The man stood perfectly still, watching us from the distance. I couldn't make out his face or any features, just his dark outline against the night. Hey! Liam called out, standing up, his voice echoing across the beach. But the figure didn't respond. He just stood there, as if he hadn't heard us. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back up the dune, disappearing over the ridge with slow, deliberate steps. Liam cursed under his breath, pacing as he tried to make sense of it. Probably just some weirdo camping nearby, he muttered, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. The man hadn't looked like a camper. He'd just been watching us, waiting. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark figure standing motionless on the dune, watching us. Liam had fallen asleep quickly, his arm draped protectively over me, but I lay there, staring at the shadows cast by the faint moonlight filtering through the tent. Every small sound outside, the rustling of the wind, the hiss of the waves, seemed sharper, more insistent. I kept straining to listen, half expecting to hear footsteps in the sand. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a soft, deliberate crunch outside, as if someone had stepped too close to our tent. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, every muscle tensing as I waited. I listened, my ears straining for any hint of movement, but after a few moments, silence settled again, deep and heavy. I told myself it was the wind or maybe a stray animal wandering too close. But the dread in my chest wouldn't ease. The next morning, I told Liam about the noise I'd heard. He brushed it off, his expression relaxed as he sipped his coffee. Probably just an animal, he said with a shrug. Raccoons or something, they're always digging around for food. I nodded, forcing myself to smile, but his reassurance did little to calm me. I felt like something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint why. As we packed a bag for a hike along the coastline, I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the dunes for any sign of movement. The beach stretched empty and serene, but I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. Our hike took us up a rocky path along the cliffs, with breathtaking views of the ocean below. The air was fresh and crisp, the wind tugging at my hair as we climbed higher. I tried to focus on the beauty around us, letting the calmness of the sea and sky distract me. For a while, it worked, and I felt myself relax, laughing with Liam as we pointed out seals sunbathing on the rocks far below. But as we made our way back to camp in the late afternoon, I caught a flash of movement near our tent. My heart dropped as I realized that the figure, the same man from the night before, was there, standing by our campfire. He was closer now, his posture relaxed, but somehow menacing, as if he had every right to be there. My grip tightened on Liam's hand, and he followed my gaze, his jaw clenching when he saw the man. Liam shouted, his voice echoing across the beach. Hey, what do you think you're doing? The man didn't respond, didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his eyes on us, watching as we approached. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was something about the way he stood, so calm, so unmoved, that made my skin prickle with unease. Liam picked up his pace, his steps purposeful, as he continued to call out to the man. But just as we reached the edge of the camp, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing over the dune with that same eerie calm. I let out a shaky breath, my heart racing as I looked at Liam. Who is that? I whispered, a note of fear creeping into my voice. Liam shook his head, frowning. I don't know, but if he comes back, we're calling the Rangers. He looked down at me, his face softening. It's probably just some guy who camped nearby and wandered over. Nothing to worry about. But even as he said it, I could see the worry in his eyes. He tried to brush it off, tried to reassure me with a smile, but I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. We decided to keep our fire going that night, its warm light flickering across the sand as we sat close together, talking quietly. Every so often, I would glance over at the dunes, half expecting to see the man reappear. But the beach remained empty, the night air cool and silent around us. Later, as we prepared for bed, I noticed that a few of our things had been moved. Small items we'd left near the tent, like our water bottles and Liam's flashlight. At first, I thought maybe Liam had moved them, but he insisted he hadn't. I felt a shiver of fear as I realized that the man had probably touched our things, had been close enough to disturb our belongings while we were gone. I tried to push the thought from my mind as we climbed into the tent, but the feeling of vulnerability lingered, like a shadow cast over our camp. I didn't say anything more to Liam, not wanting to worry him, but I lay awake long after he'd fallen asleep, my mind racing with 1,000 worst-case scenarios. Sometime around midnight, I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft, scraping noise just outside the tent, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps in the sand. I froze, my heart pounding as I listened, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. But the sounds continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone were circling our tent. I nudged Liam awake, my voice barely a whisper. "Liam, do you hear that?" He sat up, his face groggy but quickly sharpening as he listened. The footsteps paused, and for a moment the silence was so thick that I could hear the rapid beat of my own heart. Then, just as suddenly, the steps resumed, moving closer. Liam grabbed the flashlight, his jaw set as he motioned for me to stay quiet. He unzipped the tent slowly, and I held my breath, gripping the fabric of my sleeping bag. He stepped outside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he shone it around the campsite. The beam swept across the sand, revealing nothing but empty beach. "Whoever's out here, you better leave," he called out, his voice strong, though I could hear the edge of fear. The only response was the distant sound of waves and the soft rustle of wind over the dunes. After a few tense moments, he ducked back into the tent, shaking his head. "There's no one out there," he said, though his expression was far from reassured. Maybe it was just the wind, or an animal. But I could tell he didn't believe it, and neither did I. We lay back down, but sleep felt impossible. Every sound outside seemed amplified, each rustle or creak filling me with a fresh wave of anxiety. It was as if the beach itself had become hostile, an expanse of shadows hiding someone who was waiting, watching. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief, as if the daylight could somehow protect us from whatever had been lurking outside. We emerged from the tent, both of us exhausted and tense. Liam went to check the fire pit, and I walked down to the water to clear my head. But as I reached the shoreline, I stopped, a chill running down my spine. There, in the sand near our tent, were large footprints, fresh, distinct, and unmistakably human. They circled our tent, leading around the campsite and up toward the dunes, as if someone had been pacing around us all night. I called Liam over, my voice shaking as I pointed to the prints. He stared at them, his face pale. "We're not staying here another night," he said, his voice firm. "We'll pack up and go as soon as we can." I nodded, feeling a sense of relief mixed with dread. But as we started gathering our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, hiding somewhere in the dunes, watching us with a patience that was as terrifying as it was unrelenting. We packed up in tense silence, our movements quick and purposeful. Liam's jaw was set, his gaze hard as he gathered our things, but I could see the fear lurking behind his determined expression. I felt it too, a persistent gnawing dread that seemed to settle in my bones. Even with the bright morning sun overhead, the beach no longer felt like the peaceful escape it had been when we arrived. Every glance toward the dunes made my stomach twist with anxiety, as if I were bracing myself to see that shadowy figure appear again, watching us with his unsettling patience. Just as we were about to take down the tent, I heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the sand. I froze, my heart pounding as I turned toward the source of the noise. There, at the edge of our campsite, was the man, standing just a few feet away from us. He looked even closer in the light of day, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, his stance relaxed but unnerving. There was no mistaking it now. He wasn't a passerby or a fellow camper. He was here for us. Liam stepped in front of me, his body tense, shielding me from the stranger's gaze. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice firm but shaking slightly. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly as he stared at us. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. His eyes were cold, flat, with a strange intensity that made my skin prickle. He seemed completely unfazed by Liam's presence, as if he'd anticipated it, as if we were exactly where he wanted us to be. "Look, we're leaving," Liam said, his voice low and controlled. "Just stay out of our way, all right?" Still, the man didn't move, didn't speak. His lips curled into a faint smile, one that felt wrong, as if he knew something we didn't. He took a step forward, his movements slow, almost deliberate. Instinctively, I backed up, my heart pounding harder, my mind racing with a growing sense of panic. Liam grabbed my hand, tugging me toward the car. "Come on, let's go," he muttered, his grip tight as we moved quickly across the sand. The man's gaze followed us, unblinking, his smile widening as we hurried away. I threw a quick glance over my shoulder, half expecting him to follow, but he just stood there, watching us with that eerie stillness. We reached the car, and Liam fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he tried to unlock the doors. My own hands were trembling, my breaths coming quick and shallow as I cast frantic glances back toward the campsite. The man was still there, his dark silhouette standing out starkly against the pale sand. But now he was moving, slowly, methodically, walking toward us, his steps unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. The car doors finally unlocked, and we scrambled inside, slamming them shut. Liam started the engine, the tires kicking up sand as he reversed onto the dirt road. I kept my gaze on the rearview mirror, watching as the man's figure grew smaller, but even as we sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, still tracking our every movement. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We drove in tense silence, the winding coastal road passing in a blur. My hands were clenched tightly in my lap, my mind racing with a mix of fear and confusion. Who was he? Why had he been watching us? And why hadn't he tried to stop us? Finally, Liam broke the silence, his voice low and shaken. What the hell was that? Why was he just standing there like that? I shook my head, my throat tight. I don't know, but I don't think he was just another camper. There was something wrong about him. Liam nodded, his face pale, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I don't ever want to go back there. Whatever he was doing, it wasn't normal. It was like he was waiting for something. We drove for hours, only stopping once we reached a small diner on the outskirts of a nearby town. I felt a strange sense of relief as we walked inside, the chatter of people and the smell of coffee grounding me, reminding me that we were back in the world of normalcy. But even as we sat at a booth sipping coffee in silence, the tension lingered, a shadow that refused to lift. I glanced down at my hands, noticing for the first time that I'd been clenching them so tightly that my nails had left marks on my palms. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, but the image of the man's cold, unblinking eyes kept flashing in my mind, haunting me. After we'd eaten, we finally mustered the courage to talk about it, dissecting every detail, each strange moment that had led up to that last chilling encounter. But no matter how we tried to make sense of it, the man's motives remained a mystery. The only thing we knew for certain was that we'd been in danger, and that he'd enjoyed every moment of our fear. That night, back in the safety of our own home, I tried to push the memories away, tried to tell myself that we were safe now. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, that somehow he was still watching us. Every creak in the house, every shadow outside the window made my heart race, bringing back the fear I'd felt on that isolated beach. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that weekend clung to me, a dark cloud I couldn't escape. Liam tried to reassure me, tried to convince me that it was over, but even he couldn't hide his own lingering unease. We avoided beaches after that, the thought of open spaces filling us with an irrational dread. Then, one night, as I was scrolling through the photos on my phone, I came across a picture Liam had taken during our hike. It was a shot of the beach, beautiful and serene, with the waves crashing against the shore. But as I zoomed in, my blood ran cold. There, in the background, partially hidden among the dunes, was the figure of a man watching us even then, his dark silhouette a shadow against the sand. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly closed the photo, my heart pounding. I didn't tell Liam. I knew it would only disturb him further, but the image stayed with me, a grim reminder that we'd been watched from the very beginning. We hadn't stumbled upon him. He had been waiting for us, tracking our every move from the moment we arrived. To this day, I can't look at an empty stretch of beach without feeling a wave of dread. Every time I close my eyes, I see him standing there, motionless and patient, as if he's waiting for us to return. And somewhere deep down, I know that if we ever go back, he'll be there, watching, waiting, and ready.